Donald Trump leaned into the microphone, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards of the studio. It wasn't a shout. It was something far more unsettling. It was the sound of a predator who had cornered its prey and was taking a moment to savor the inevitable. This was live television, prime time, the kind of event that stops the world. 200 people were packed into the studio audience, their collective body heat rising under the glare of the studio lights. Every major network, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, was carrying the feed live. Outside, the world was watching. Inside, the air was so thick with tension, you could almost taste the ozone. This was the confrontation everyone had been waiting for. The unstoppable force meeting the immovable object, or so the media had billed it. "Look, I've been watching you for 40 years, Trump continued, his eyes locked onto the woman sitting 10 feet across from him. 40 years of failure. And you know what's amazing? What's truly incredible? You somehow got richer while your city got poorer. Exponentially richer. That's quite a trick." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I'm a businessman. I've made money my whole life. I built skylines. I know how money works. And even I can't figure out how you pulled that off." A shark-like grin spread across his face. "Actually, I can. We all can. And that's why we're here tonight." Nancy Pelosi sat across from him, poised, frozen in a posture of practiced elegance. She had walked in first, radiating the confidence of a woman who believed she owned the building. That signature smirk had been plastered on her face, the one that said, "I know something you don't." She had spent the entire week dismissing Trump in interview after interview. On CNN, she called him uninformed and dangerous. On MSNBC, she laughed and said he didn't understand the first thing about how government actually works. On The View, she had practically rolled her eyes at the suggestion that she would even debate him, treating the event like a charity appearance she was graciously attending to humor a child. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Trump had walked in 5 minutes after her, and the energy in the room had shifted instantly. It wasn't just charisma. It was a shift in atmospheric pressure. The audience felt it. The moderator, a seasoned journalist who suddenly looked like a deer in headlights, felt it. And deep down, beneath the layers of political armor, Nancy felt it too. The moderator cleared his throat, shuffling his index cards with trembling hands, trying to start his carefully prepared opening remarks about decorum and time limits. "Welcome to tonight's historic." Trump didn't let him finish. He didn't even look at him. "Before we waste time with formalities," Trump boomed, cutting the air like a knife. "Nancy, I've got a quick question for you." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, casual, like they were old friends catching up at a diner, except for the cold calculation in his eyes. "How does someone who makes $174,000 a year, that's your salary, right? A government salary, set by law. We all know it. How does that person end up worth $300 million? The question hung in the air, simple, brutal, and impossible to ignore. "Seriously," Trump pressed, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "I genuinely want to know the secret. Because that math doesn't math. The numbers don't work. You can save every penny, you can eat ramen noodles every night for 40 years, and you don't get to $300 million on a government paycheck. You want to help me understand your math?" The crowd stirred immediately. It started as a low murmur, a ripple of shock that someone had actually said the quiet part out loud on national television. Then, a few nervous chuckles broke out. Pelosi's smile tightened at the corners. It didn't drop. She was too much of a professional for that. but it became brittle. Her eyes, usually sharp and darting, fixed on a point somewhere past Trump's left shoulder. Her hands, resting on the polished wood of the table, gripped the armrests just a little bit tighter. The knuckles turned a shade of ivory. The high-definition cameras, zoomed in for the reaction shot, caught it all. The slight twitch of the eyelid, the tension in the neck. This wasn't the debate she had prepared for. She had prepared for policy wonkery. She had prepared for shouting matches about health care or insults about her appearance. She hadn't prepared for a forensic audit of her bank account. You know, in my business, if the numbers don't add up, the IRS comes knocking, Trump said, leaning back now, looking relaxed. If the numbers don't add up, investors sue you. But in your world, in the swamp, the numbers don't add up and you just buy another mansion. How does that work, Nancy? Is there a special calculator in the Speaker's office that adds zeros to everything? He gestured to the audience, inviting them into the interrogation. Think about it, folks. $174,000. After taxes, living in D.C., living in San Francisco, two of the most expensive cities on earth. How much is left over? Maybe a little? Maybe nothing? But somehow, her net worth graph looks like a hockey stick going straight up. Vertical. Trump shook his head, feigning amazement. It's a miracle. That's what it is. A financial miracle. Or, he dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, or it's the greatest grift in the history of American politics. And tonight, we're going to find out which one it is. The moderator tried to interject. Mr. President, if we could stick to the agreed-upon topics. This is the topic, Trump shouted, snapping his head toward the moderator before turning back to Pelosi. The topic is corruption. The topic is how the people in charge are ripping off the people in this room. And she is the queen of it. Look at her. She can't even answer. She's doing the math in her head right now, trying to figure out how to spin $300 million. This was going to be a very long night for Nancy Pelosi. Donald Trump settled back into his leather chair, getting comfortable. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, a signal that he was just getting started, that he was settling in for a long, leisurely dismantling. Let's talk about your husband, Nancy, Trump said. The mention of Paul Pelosi acted like a physical blow. Nancy stiffened. Her husband was supposed to be off-limits, a private citizen, a businessman. But Trump didn't care about the unwritten rules of the Washington cocktail circuit. He cared about the kill. Paul Pelosi, Trump mused, looking at the ceiling as if recalling a fond memory. Great guy, I'm sure. Very successful. Smart man. Venture capitalist. And let me tell you something, folks. He turned to the cameras, his face dead serious. Paul is the luckiest investor who has ever lived. I mean it. The luckiest. Nobody in the history of Wall Street, nobody in the history of money has been this consistently, perfectly, unbelievably lucky. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. They knew where this was going, but hearing it framed as luck made the absurdity of it land harder. Better than Warren Buffett, Trump declared. And Warren Buffett's been doing this for what, 70 years? The Oracle of Omaha, a genius. Paul beats him. Better than every hedge fund manager on Wall Street. Better than Ray Dalio. Better than George Soros. Better than the guys at Goldman Sachs. Trump spread his hands wide. These people do this professionally, full-time. They have armies of analysts from Harvard and Yale. They have supercomputers. They have algorithms trading in milliseconds. And Paul? Paul beats them all from his kitchen table while married to the Speaker of the House. Isn't that amazing? More laughter now. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. Pelosi shifted in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs. She reached for her water glass, her hand hovering for a second before grasping it. Now, Nancy is going to tell you, and I want you to listen to this, because it's fascinating. She's going to tell you that she doesn't discuss her work with Paul, Trump said, adopting a mocking, high-pitched tone. Oh, I don't talk to my husband about legislation. We keep it separate. He snorted. Okay, let's think about that. They've been married for what? 60 years? 60-plus years. You live in the same house. You sleep in the same bed. You have dinner together every night. But you never talk about work? You never mention, hey, honey, big tech bill coming up for a vote next week? You never mention, boy, we're really going to crack down on credit card companies? He looked at the audience, eyebrows raised. Either they have the weirdest marriage in America, or Paul is psychic. Those are your only two options. Because let me tell you what happened. This is a true story. Nancy can fact-check me on this. We'll wait. Trump paused for effect. Pelosi was arranging papers in front of her, shuffling them pointlessly, avoiding eye contact with the man destroying her reputation. Paul makes a bet, Trump said, leaning in. A huge bet. We're not talking a few $1,000s. We're talking millions. He buys options. You know what options are? They're basically bets that let you control huge amounts of stock for less money. High risk, massive reward. But only if you know what's going to happen. He buys options on a company that makes computer chips. NVIDIA. You know, AI, the hot thing. Everyone wants these chips. Cannot get enough of them. Demand through the roof. Trump let that hang in the air. And then, stay with me here, this is important. Right after Paul makes this bet, weeks later, Nancy brings a bill to the floor of the House. The CHIPS Act. A massive bill. $52 billion. With a B. Subsidies, tax breaks, government money, your money, all going to the chip industry. The crowd was completely silent now. The laughter had died down, replaced by a cold realization of the scale of the accusation. The bill passes, Trump said softly. Nancy makes sure it passes. She whips the votes. And suddenly, boom. That company Paul bet on? The stock goes through the roof. Way up. Massive gains. Paul's options are worth millions more than what he paid. Millions. Just like that. Trump shook his head slowly, wearing an expression of exaggerated disbelief. Now, Nancy is going to say this is all coincidence. Just lucky timing. Paul just happened to wake up that morning and think, I feel good about chips. Right before Nancy just happened to push through a law that gave them billions of dollars. Just happened. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Pelosi jumped in, her voice sharp, defensive already, cutting through the silence like a jagged piece of glass. Mr. Trump, my husband makes his own investment decisions. I have absolutely no involvement in his portfolio. Right before votes you control. Trump cut her off smoothly, louder, overpowering her. Right before legislation you schedule. Right before laws that affect the exact companies he's betting on. That's all just coincidence? Trump shouted. I don't discuss pending legislation with... So he's psychic, Trump roared. That's what you're telling America. Your husband can predict the future. He just knows when to buy and when to sell. He just knows which bills will pass and which won't. Lucky guesses over and over and over again. And here's my favorite part, Trump said, pointing a finger at the audience. There is an investment fund, a real fund. You can look it up on your phones right now. It trades on the stock market. And you know what this fund's strategy is? He waited, letting the anticipation build. They copy Paul's trades. That's it. That's the whole strategy. Whatever Paul Pelosi buys, they buy. Whatever he sells, they sell. They just follow along behind him like lost puppies. And you know what the ticker symbol is? The stock symbol? Take a guess. Someone in the audience, emboldened by the moment, shouted, "Nank!" Trump pointed at them, beaming. Exactly. Nank. Your initials, Nancy. They literally named the fund after you. Because everyone knows. Everyone on Wall Street knows. If you want to make money, you don't look at the economy. You don't look at earnings reports. You follow Nancy Pelosi's husband's trades. Because somehow, magically, mysteriously, those trades always win. And this fund, Trump continued, his voice rising over the growing murmurs of the crowd, this Nance fund, do you want to know how it performed last year? He paused, looking out at the audience, inviting them to guess the punchline of a joke they were all paying for. While regular Americans were watching their retirement accounts struggle, while hardworking people were seeing their 401ks shrink, while inflation was eating everyone's lunch, this fund made over 50% returns. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 50%. In a market where most people were happy to break even. Just by copying the trades of a man married to the Speaker of the House, Trump said, shaking his head. The man who supposedly doesn't talk to his wife about her work. The psychic venture capitalist who just happens to nail every single trade right before the news breaks. He sat back, letting the audience react. The booing was audible now, not a playful booing, but a deep, resonant sound of genuine anger. But Nancy, Trump said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, I'm sure it's all legal, right? Technically legal. Because that's what you people do. You write the rules. You create the loopholes. You make sure you can do whatever you want. And then you look into the camera and tell us it's legal. Even though everyone with half a brain knows exactly what's happening. Pelosi finally found her voice. It came out higher than normal, strained, lacking the imperious authority she commanded on the House floor. My husband has his own business, she stammered. He has been a successful investor for decades. This is a personal attack on my family. It's your record, Trump shot back. These are your financial disclosures. You filed them. They're public. I'm just asking the questions that every American wants to ask. There's a senator, Trump continued, bulldozing over her attempt to interrupt. Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri. Good guy. He introduced a bill to stop this. You know what he called it originally? The Pelosi Act. Pelosi. Preventing elected leaders from owning securities and investments. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He literally named the anti-corruption bill after you. That was the point. That's how notorious this is. They had to rename it because Democrats wouldn't support it with your name on it. Too embarrassing, but everyone knows. Everyone remembers. The bill designed to stop politicians from getting rich off their office was named after Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi was blinking rapidly now, fighting back something, anger, tears, or perhaps the realization that her legacy was being rewritten in real time. So, let me ask you one more time, Nancy, Trump said, leaning forward. How does someone making $174,000 a year end up with $300 million in assets? That math doesn't math. And tonight, everyone knows why. You used your position. You used your power. You traded on information that nobody else gets. Information that would land a regular person in prison. But for you, it's just Tuesday. The crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation for the prosecution. Pelosi looked around, searching for an ally, a friendly face, but she was alone on an island of her own making. "But, Nancy," Trump said, settling back into his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "the money, the insider trading, that's just the beginning. Let's talk about what you've done with all that money. Let's talk about your city, the city you've represented for 40 years. Let's talk about San Francisco." The crowd got louder. They knew what was coming. Pelosi's face went pale. "San Francisco," Trump repeated, savoring the syllables. "Beautiful San Francisco. I remember when it was gorgeous, truly gorgeous. The Golden Gate Bridge, Fisherman's Wharf, cable cars. It was one of America's crown jewels. Some people used to say it was the best city in the country." He paused, letting the past tense hang in the air like a funeral bell. "You've been representing San Francisco since 1987. That's almost 40 years. 37 years, to be exact. You've had this job longer than most people have been alive. That's your city. That's Nancy's city." Trump looked directly at her. "So, Nancy, after 37 years, how's it going? How's your city doing? Want to give us an update?" Pelosi's jaw tightened. She knew where this was going. "I'll tell you how it's doing," Trump said, his voice dropping to a growl. "It's doing terribly, horrifically, catastrophically. It has become, and I want to be clear, these aren't my words, I'm quoting news reports. It has become a public toilet." A few nervous laughs bubbled up, but Trump didn't smile. "You've got people living in tents everywhere. Not a few unfortunate people down on their luck. Thousands, tens of thousands. So many that the city stopped counting because the numbers were too embarrassing. You've got human waste on the sidewalks," Trump said, painting the picture. "In the streets, on the curbs, human waste, in one of the wealthiest cities on planet Earth. Parents walking with their children have to explain why the sidewalk smells like that. They have to cross the street to avoid the piles. In America, in 2026, in Nancy Pelosi's district. There's a neighborhood, the Tenderloin," Trump said. "You know it, Nancy. Of course you do. It's in your district. They did a study. And you know what they found? The Tenderloin has been the, excuse my language, the poopiest neighborhood in San Francisco for 3 years running. They track human waste reports, thousands of them, just in 1/4 of 1 year. That's your district. The homeless crisis is a national—" Pelosi tried to interject. "Don't do that." Trump's hand shot up. "Don't tell me it's a national problem. You've had 37 years, Nancy. 37 years. At some point, it becomes your problem. At some point, you own it." The crowd erupted again. Trump waited for them to quiet down. "You want to talk national? Fine. Let's talk about the money. Because you love spending other people's money. Let's talk about how much you've spent trying to fix this." He started counting on his fingers again. 1 year, you spent about $160 million on homelessness. And you know what happened? It got worse. The next year, you spent $240 million. Almost doubled it. And what happened? It got even worse. So then, you really go big. You spent $364 million. He leaned forward. $364 million. That's more money than some countries have. And the problem got worse. After spending enough to build 50 schools, enough to fix every road in the city twice, the problem got worse. "That is quite an achievement, Nancy," Trump mocked. "In the private sector, if you spent that much money and made things worse, you'd be fired immediately. But in Nancy Pelosi's government, you just ask for more money." "Businesses are leaving," Trump continued. "Oracle, huge tech company. They held their massive conference in San Francisco for years, brought millions of dollars to the city. They moved it to Las Vegas. They said, "No, thank you. We're not going back to San Francisco." Cost the city $64 million in revenue. Gone. Because it was too dangerous, too disgusting. Someone in the back shouted, "San Francisco values!" It became a chant. San Francisco values. San Francisco values. Trump nodded along. "That's right. San Francisco values. And you know what the best part is?" Nancy said, and I quote, "I want America to have San Francisco values." You literally said that. You want tents in every city? You want crime everywhere? You want human waste on every street? That's your vision for America? "But Nancy," Trump said, raising his voice over the chant, "I get it. I understand why you don't see the problem. Because you don't live in that San Francisco. You don't live in the tents. You don't smell the waste. You don't see the needles." He leaned back, looking her up and down. "You live in a different San Francisco, don't you? You live in Pacific Heights? You know where Pacific Heights is? It's the nice part. The really, really nice part. Where the streets are clean. Where the police actually show up. Where you need security just to keep the riffraff out." "How much is your house worth, Nancy?" Trump asked. 25 million? 30 million? It's hard to say exactly. Property records are funny like that. But it's worth a lot. I'm sure it's gorgeous. Probably has a view of the bay. Probably has a wine cellar. Definitely has walls. Definitely has security. And you've got another place," Trump added casually. "A vineyard in Napa Valley. Wine country. How much is that worth? 6 million? 8 million? 10 million? Acres and acres of grapes. The good life." Trump's voice hardened. "So, while the people in your district are stepping over needles, while they're afraid to let their kids play outside, while they're watching their businesses die, you're living in paradise. You're in your mansion, drinking your wine from your vineyard, counting your $300 million. You're doing great. And that's what matters, right?" Pelosi sat there, shoulders slumped. The fight was leaving her. "But at least you can relate to regular people, right?" Trump asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "At least you understand what they're going through." "Oh, wait. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about April of 2020. Let's talk about the ice cream." The crowd went absolutely crazy. They knew this story. It was the moment the mask had slipped. "April 2020, Trump said, his voice soft, storytelling mode engaged. "Does everyone remember April 2020? Of course you do. The COVID lockdowns. The entire world stopped. The economy crashed. In 1 month, 22 million Americans lost their jobs." He paused, letting the memory of that fear wash over the room. Food banks ran out of food. Grocery stores had empty shelves. People were terrified. Parents didn't know how they'd feed their kids. Families didn't know how they'd make rent. The whole country was in crisis. Real crisis. "And Nancy Pelosi," Trump said, pointing a finger at her, "she decided that was the perfect time to go on television and show America how she was coping. She goes on a late-night show from her kitchen, and she shows everyone her refrigerators. Plural. Not one. 2. Massive commercial-grade sub-zero refrigerators. You know what those cost? $24,000. $24,000 for 2 refrigerators. And she opens one up," Trump continued, building the momentum. "She slides out a drawer, and it is packed, absolutely packed, full of ice cream, gourmet, specialty ice cream, the kind you have to order from fancy catalogs, $13 a pint, chocolate, more chocolate, even more chocolate." And she says, these are her actual words, "We all have found our ways to keep our spirits up. Mine just happens to be filling up my freezer." Trump shook his head, looking at the audience with disgust. While she was showing off her ice cream collection, let me tell you what was happening in the real world. Food banks had lines stretching for miles. Actual miles. People waiting 6 hours in their cars just to get a box of food. Mothers crying because they couldn't feed their children. Fathers ashamed because they had lost their jobs. And Nancy Pelosi was showing off her $24,000 refrigerators in her $30 million mansion, bragging about how she never runs out of $13 ice cream. "I was trying to bring some levity," Pelosi tried to whisper. "Levity?" Trump's voice boomed. "You want to talk about levity? 22 million people lost everything. And you want to brag about your ice cream? That's not levity. That's Marie Antoinette." "They called you Nancy Antoinette," Trump said. "And they were right. Let them eat cake? No. Your version was, let them eat ice cream. Let them watch me never run out while they run out of everything. You said, I have no concern. Remember that? I have no concern about the obvious investments that have been made." "Of course you don't have concern, Nancy. You're worth $300 million. You never run out." Trump stood up, pacing the stage, energized by the anger in the room. It was obscene. It was disgusting. It was everything wrong with Washington in one 3-minute video. You are so rich, so removed, so disconnected from reality that you thought this was normal. You thought this would make people like you. He sat back down, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "That's not leadership, Nancy. That's not compassion. That's the ice cream oligarch. That's San Francisco values. Get rich, live in a mansion, eat your gourmet ice cream, and let everyone else starve." The audience erupted. San Francisco values. Nancy Antoinette. The chants merged into a wall of sound. Pelosi sat frozen, blinking rapidly, looking for an escape that wasn't there. She had been stripped bare, her wealth and her disconnect laid out for the world to see. And Trump wasn't done yet. The echoes of Nancy Antoinette were still bouncing off the studio walls when Donald Trump raised his hand, silencing the crowd with the ease of a conductor. He didn't smile this time. His expression shifted from mockery to something colder, something more prosecutorial. "But Nancy," Trump said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "let's assume for a second that the ice cream was just a mistake, a bad look. We all make mistakes, right? But at least you follow the rules you set for everyone else. At least you respect the laws you pass. At least you don't think you're above the little people." He paused, letting the sarcasm drip. "Oh, wait. No, we can't say that either. Let's talk about the hair salon. Let's talk about August 2020. Pelosi's eyes squeezed shut for a fraction of a second. She knew this was coming. It was the moment that had stripped away her moral high ground forever. "August of 2020, Trump narrated, setting the scene for the audience. "We are still in the thick of the pandemic. Your state, California, run by your nephew, Gavin Newsom, is in total lockdown. Businesses are shuttered. Schools are closed. Churches are empty. The government has told every barber, every stylist, every salon owner, you cannot open. It is too dangerous. If you open, we will fine you. We will arrest you. We will take your license." Trump leaned forward. Americans were following those rules. They were watching their life savings evaporate because they wanted to be good citizens. They wanted to stay safe. But Nancy Pelosi? Trump shook his head. Nancy needed a blowout. "Her hair," Trump said, gesturing to his own head. That hair requires maintenance, expensive maintenance, weekly maintenance, and the rules, the laws, those are for the peasants. Those aren't for the Speaker of the House. So what does she do? She calls up a salon owner in San Francisco, a woman who is bleeding money, who is terrified of losing her business. And Nancy says, "Open up, just for me. I need to look good for television." The crowd murmured, the anger bubbling up again. "And she goes in," Trump continued, "walks right in, indoors, no mask, getting her hair washed, getting it styled, getting prepped for another interview where she would tell you to wear a mask and stay home." "But here is the best part," Trump said, standing up and pacing the small stage. "This is the part that tells you everything about her soul. She got caught. The salon had security cameras. Of course they did. It's a business. And the footage leaked. America saw Nancy Pelosi walking around with wet hair and no mask while their businesses were padlocked by the police." "And what did she do when she got caught?" Trump asked, turning to face her. "Did she apologize? Did she say, 'I'm sorry, I was selfish'? Did she say, 'I made a mistake'?" "No," he roared. "She blamed the salon owner." "She said it was a setup," Trump shouted, his voice incredulous. "A setup. She said the owner of the salon, a single mom, a small business owner fighting for her life. She said that woman tricked her. Tricked her into walking in? Tricked her into taking off her mask? Tricked her into getting a blowout?" "The arrogance," Trump said, shaking his head. "The absolute arrogance to crush a small business owner just to save your own skin. You destroyed that woman, Nancy. You know that? Her business got death threats. She had to close down. She had to leave San Francisco. She lost everything because she dared to expose you. That is what happens when you cross Nancy Pelosi," Trump told the audience, pointing a finger at her. "You get crushed. You become the villain in her story. Because in Nancy's world, she is the queen, and the rest of you are just subjects." He walked back to his chair, but remained standing. "And it wasn't just the salon," Trump added, piling on. "Remember February 2020, before the lockdowns, when I was restricting travel from China to save lives? What was Nancy doing?" "She was in Chinatown," Trump bellowed. "In San Francisco, having a parade, telling everyone, 'Come on down, join the crowds, it's perfectly safe, hug a tourist.'" "She wanted a photo op," Trump said with disgust. "She wanted to prove she wasn't racist. She wanted to show she was inclusive. So she encouraged people to gather in crowds in the middle of a pandemic. And then, 3 weeks later, she's screaming at me about not doing enough? She's screaming at you for leaving your house?" "Rules for thee, but not for me," Trump said, reciting the line like a verdict. "That is the Nancy Pelosi motto. Encourages crowds when it helps her photo op. Demands lockdowns when it helps her power. Breaks those lockdowns when she needs a haircut. And destroys anyone who points out the hypocrisy." The crowd began to chant it. "Rules for thee, not for me. Rules for thee, not for me." Pelosi sat there, her posture finally slumping. The armor was gone. The imperious speaker who tore up the State of the Union address was gone. In her place was a politician who had been stripped naked in front of the world. "You are a hypocrite, Nancy," Trump said, his voice quiet now, deadly serious. "The definition of a hypocrite. And tonight, everyone knows it." "But Nancy," Trump said, raising his hand to quiet the crowd. He settled back into his chair, shifting gears. The personal attacks were done. Now came the professional dismantling. "Let's put aside the hair. Let's put aside the ice cream. Let's talk about your actual job, your judgment, your ability to lead. You tried to remove me from office, Trump said. Twice. You impeached me 2 times. That is your legacy. You are the only speaker in American history to impeach a president twice. He leaned forward, his face hardening. And you failed. Twice. 2 times you came at me, Trump said. 2 times you threw the entire weight of the federal government against me. Millions of dollars, months of hearings, lawyers, witnesses, subpoenas. You stopped the country cold to pursue your vendetta. And what happened? Trump asked, spreading his hands. I'm still here. You're sitting across from me. You lost. You went 0 for 2. That is a perfect record of failure. Pelosi tried to speak, her voice raspy. The Senate refused to hear the avide. The Senate did their job, Trump cut her off. They looked at your evidence. They looked at your Russian collusion hoax, which we now know was paid for by Hillary Clinton. They looked at your Ukraine hoax, and they said, not guilty, acquitted, forever. But let's talk about the second one, Trump said, his eyes narrowing. Let's talk about January 6th, because you love to talk about January 6th. You made it the centerpiece of your career. But let's talk about who was actually responsible for security that day. Pelosi's head snapped up. This was the third rail, the one topic she thought she was safe on. You are the Speaker of the House, Trump said, pointing a finger directly at her chest. The Capitol Police report to you. Security protocols report to you. It is your building. It is your job to keep it safe. And you know what? Trump said, his voice dropping to a hush. Days before January 6th, I offered help. I offered the National Guard, 10,000 troops, 20,000 troops, standing by, ready to go, just in case, just to be safe. He waited a beat. And you know what you did? You said no. The audience gasped. This was a detail the mainstream media rarely covered, but Trump was putting it on the record, live, with 100 million people watching. You rejected the offer, Trump continued. You turned down the help. You didn't want the optics of soldiers at the Capitol. You thought it looked bad, so you left the police understaffed. You left the building vulnerable. And then, Trump's voice rose, when the breach happened, when the chaos started, you blamed me. You blamed me for your security failure. You blamed me for your incompetence. That's not true, Pelosi stammered, looking visibly shaken. It is documented, Trump shouted. The Inspector General's report shows the offer was made. It shows the rejection. It is on the record. You rushed through an impeachment in 1 day, Trump accused. 1 day. No hearings, no evidence, no due process. Why? Were you angry? Sure. But maybe you were scared. Maybe you needed a scapegoat. Maybe you needed to point the finger at Donald Trump so nobody would ask why Nancy Pelosi left the Capitol wide open. He stood up again, towering over the table. You failed to protect the Capitol, Trump declared. And then you wasted millions of taxpayer dollars trying to impeach me to cover up your own failure. That is not defending democracy, Nancy. That is playing politics with national security. 2 impeachments, Trump said, shaking his head. 2 failures. Millions of dollars wasted. The country divided. And for what? For your ego? For your revenge? You wasted the country's time, Trump said, delivering the verdict. While people were suffering from COVID, while the economy was hurting, you were obsessed with getting me. You prioritized your hatred of Trump over the needs of the American people. And you lost, Trump said, with a final dismissive wave. You lost then. And looking at you tonight, You're losing now." The crowd was on its feet again. The momentum was unstoppable. Trump had taken her strongest weapon, the impeachments, and turned them into proof of her incompetence. Nancy Pelosi sat in the wreckage of her career, and there were still minutes left on the clock. The applause died down, but the tension in the room remained at a fever pitch. Donald Trump didn't rush to fill the silence this time. He let it hang there, heavy and suffocating. He looked at Nancy Pelosi, not with the anger he had shown moments ago, but with something that looked almost like pity. "But Nancy," Trump said, his voice dropping to a soft, reflective register that drew every person in the room toward him, "I want you to think about something. I want you to really think about it. I want you to think about your career, your legacy, what you've actually accomplished, what you will be remembered for." Pelosi looked up, her eyes glassy. She was bracing for another insult, another shout. But this was worse. This was an autopsy. 37 years in Congress, Trump said slowly. 37 years representing San Francisco, making laws, spending taxpayer money, wielding power. That is longer than most people work in their entire lives. That is longer than most careers last. You have been in Washington since 1987. Think about that. 1987. Ronald Reagan was president. The internet didn't exist. That is how long you have been there. He let the numbers sink in. 4 decades of power. In those 37 years, Trump asked, "What happened to your city? What happened to San Francisco?" He didn't wait for an answer. He answered for her. It got worse. Every single year. Measurably. Statistically. Undeniably worse. There are more homeless people today than when you started. There is more crime today than when you started. There are more drugs today than when you started. The schools are worse. The streets are dirtier. The businesses are fewer. You spent hundreds of millions of dollars, Trump continued. Billions, if you count the federal aid. Other people's money. And it got worse. That isn't an opinion, Nancy. That is a fact. That is the record. You presided over the decline of one of the greatest cities in the world. Trump paused. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Now, let's look at the other side of the ledger. In those same 37 years, what happened to you? What happened to Nancy Pelosi? A hush fell over the crowd. You got richer, Trump whispered. Dramatically richer, exponentially richer. You went from a standard government salary to having $300 million in assets. That is a lot of wealth, Nancy. That is generational wealth. That is dynasty wealth. And you made it while working for the government. He spread his hands. The math doesn't math. We established that at the beginning. Remember? The numbers simply do not work. Unless. He let the word hang there, pregnant with implication. Unless you were using your position. Unless you were using your access. Unless you were using your knowledge. Unless you were using your power to enrich yourself while your city burned. Pelosi stared at the table. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't look at the audience. She couldn't look at the cameras. She was trapped in the spotlight of her own record. And when Americans were suffering, Trump said, his voice hardening again, when they lost their jobs, when they lost their homes, when they lost hope, what did you do? You showed them your ice cream, he said with disgust. You showed them your $24,000 refrigerators. You showed them your mansion. You showed them your vineyard. You showed them that you are fine, that you are thriving, that you are doing great. While they were dying, Trump added, the words hitting like hammer blows. That is not service, Nancy. That is not leadership. That is not caring about people. That is using people. That is exploiting people. That is getting rich off the suffering of the men and women you are supposed to represent. He stood up then. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was the final ascent. He towered over the table, buttoning his jacket, preparing to deliver the closing argument. "You failed your city," Trump declared. "You failed your constituents, and you failed the country. But you succeeded in one thing. You succeeded in making yourself very, very rich. That is your San Francisco value," Trump said. "Get rich while everything else falls apart. That is quite an achievement." Donald Trump stood at the center of the stage, commanding the room with a presence that felt less like a politician and more like a force of nature. The audience was on the edge of their seats, sensing the end, sensing the knockout blow. "You made rules you didn't follow," Trump bellowed, ticking off the counts of the indictment on his fingers. "You broke laws you demanded others obey. You destroyed a small business owner just because she exposed you. You wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on failed impeachments because of your own vendettas. You let your city rot into a public toilet while you got wealthy." He pointed a finger at her, his voice rising to a crescendo. "You showed off your luxury while Americans starved. You blamed others for your failures. You took no accountability for your actions. Not once. Not ever." "That is Nancy Pelosi," Trump roared. "That is your record. That is your legacy. That is what history will remember." He looked out at the cameras, addressing the millions watching at home. "They won't remember the first female speaker. They won't remember the powerful leader. They won't remember the legislative achievements. They will remember the ice cream oligarch. They will remember the corrupt politician who got rich while her city died. They will remember San Francisco values." The audience erupted. It started in the back row and swept forward like a tidal wave. "Nancy Antoinette! Nancy Antoinette!" The chant filled the room, loud, angry, and mocking. The moderator tried to intervene, tried to wrap up the segment, but his voice was swallowed by the noise. Nobody was listening to him. They were watching history. Trump walked around his chair. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a platitude. He had said what he came to say. He had done what he came to do. He had destroyed who he came to destroy. He headed for the exit, his stride long and confident. Pelosi sat there, frozen. She was unable to move, unable to speak. Her hands were still gripping the armrests, her knuckles white, her face a mask of shock. The armor she had worn for 40 years, the designer suits, the polished talking points, the media protection, had been stripped away. The cameras stayed on her. They zoomed in, capturing every detail of the defeat. The slight tremble in her lip, the vacancy in her eyes, the realization that it was over. The ice cream oligarch had melted completely. Trump stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one last time. He leaned into the boom mic that was hovering nearby. "The math doesn't math, Nancy," he said, his voice calm, final. "It never did. And now, everyone knows why." 8 words, simple, devastating. True. He turned and walked through the curtains, leaving her alone on the stage with the chanting crowd and the ruins of her reputation. The lights seemed to dim around her. For the first time in decades, Nancy Pelosi wasn't the most powerful woman in the room. She was just a politician who had been caught. The broadcast cut to black, but the damage was permanent. The interview had done what 2 impeachments couldn't, what decades of Republican attacks hadn't managed, what her own scandals hadn't accomplished. It had shown America exactly who Nancy Pelosi was. And America had been watching. All of America. The system was broken. Nancy Pelosi was the proof. And now, thanks to 60 minutes of brutal, unvarnished truth, everyone knew it. The reckoning had finally arrived. Mike Johnson stood in the center of the hearing room, a solitary figure of calm amidst the emotional wreckage he had just created. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pacing frantically. He simply stood there, effectively blocking out the cameras, the aides, and the partisan noise, focusing his entire being on the woman sitting across from him. "So, let's tally it up," Johnson said. His voice carried the weight of the evidence he had spent the last 90 minutes laying out. 3 banker boxes of receipts, reports, and photos that now lay scattered across the witness table like the debris of a plane crash. "Let's count the cost of Maxine Waters." He raised his right hand, his fingers splayed. It was a simple gesture, primitive and effective. It signaled a reckoning. 1. He curled his thumb. "You live in a $6 million mansion in Hancock Park. Not in your district. In a wealthy, gated enclave, shielded from the poverty, the crime, and the despair you claim to represent. You sleep in safety, while your constituents sleep in fear." He raised his index finger. 2. The finger pointed toward the ceiling like an accusation. "Your daughter, Karen Waters, has received over $750,000 from your campaign committee. A slate mailer scheme that you, and only you, used to funnel donor money directly into your family's bank account. You turned your campaign into a family trust fund." He raised his middle finger. 3. The count continued, methodical and relentless. "Your husband, Sidney Williams, sat on the board of One United Bank. You arranged a personal meeting with the Treasury Secretary during a financial crisis. The bank got a $12 million bailout, and his stock was saved. Meanwhile, your constituents got foreclosure notices." He raised his ring finger. 4. The hand was filling up, a visual representation of corruption. "Your grandson, Mikhail Moore, your chief of staff. He was reproved by the House Ethics Committee for coordinating that bailout. He worked for you. You claimed ignorance. The committee called it a conflict of interest. He took the fall so you could stay in power." He raised his pinky finger. A full hand now, open and damning. 5. Johnson didn't blink. "The Federal Election Commission, $68,000 in fines, illegal cash payments, excessive contributions. You broke the law, you got caught, and you paid the fine with donor money. You used the people's money to pay for your own corruption." He switched to his left hand, raising a thumb. 6. The list was too long for one hand. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, a liberal watchdog group, your allies. They named you the most corrupt member of Congress 4 separate times: 2005, 2006, 2009, 2011. Even your friends know what you are. He raised his left index finger. 7 points. 7. Johnson lowered his hands, letting them rest on the podium. District 43. The reality on the ground. Poverty at 43%. Homelessness up 264%. Schools failing. Crime rising. 33 years of decline under your watch. Everything you touch gets worse for them, while everything gets better for you. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. 7 points of failure, Chairwoman, Johnson said softly. 7 distinct pieces of evidence that tell the same story. He walked slowly toward her table. "This isn't about one mistake," Johnson said. "This isn't about bad luck. This is a pattern. It is a career built on self-enrichment, disguised as public service." He paused, letting the next phrase load in the chamber. "Some people in your district call you the poverty pimp," Johnson said. Waters flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, the mask of composure completely shattered. "That is an offensive, racist slur," she hissed, her voice trembling with genuine rage. "It didn't come from me," Johnson replied calmly, refusing to yield the moral high ground. "It came from them. It came from the black residents of South Los Angeles, who stand on street corners with signs. It came from the people who realized that you profit from their poverty." He picked up a photo from the table, an image of a protest in Leimert Park. It featured Waters' face superimposed on a dollar bill, held by a man who looked tired of waiting for help. "They call you that because they see the mechanism," Johnson explained. "You campaign on their suffering. You tell them they are victims. You get elected. You get rich. They stay poor. And then, 2 years later, you come back and do it all over again." "It is a cycle," Johnson said. "Promise. Elect. Enrich. Blame. Repeat." He looked at her with a searching, almost sorrowful expression. "Looking at the evidence here today, the mansion, the daughter, the husband, the fines, can you really blame them for thinking that?" "The gentleman is out of order," Waters shouted, clutching her microphone stand. But she didn't bang the gavel. She didn't call for the sergeant-at-arms. She just gripped the edge of the table, looking small and cornered. "I am asking a question," Johnson said, "and I think we finally have the answer." He walked back to the witness table, leaning close to the microphone for the final question. The cameras zoomed in tight on his face, then hers. "So, Chairwoman Waters, do you care about the people of District 43, or do you just care about getting re-elected so your family can keep getting rich?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Waters opened her mouth. She looked at the camera. She looked at Johnson. She looked at the water she had spilled on the table. But she didn't speak. She couldn't say, "I care," because the receipts on the table screamed that she didn't. She couldn't say, "I don't," because it would be political suicide. So she sat there, silent. A woman who had made a career out of reclaiming her time was now letting it slip away, second by agonizing second. Johnson nodded slowly. "Your silence is your answer." Mike Johnson began to pack up his boxes. He moved with the same methodical calm he had entered with 90 minutes ago. He placed the photos of the mansion back in the folder. He stacked the FEC documents. He closed the lid on the One United binder. Each movement was deliberate, a final punctuation mark on the proceedings. "Mr. Chairman," Johnson said, addressing the Republican chair of the committee, "I have no further questions. I believe the evidence speaks for itself." He picked up the top box. "Congresswoman Waters has spent 33 years enriching herself and her family while her constituents suffer," Johnson said, delivering the verdict to the American people. "She lives in a $6 million mansion while they live in poverty. She won't live in her own district because she knows she failed to make it safe." He picked up the second box. Her daughter got $750,000. Her husband's bank got $12 million. She paid $68,000 in fines, and her constituents got nothing. He picked up the third box. "That is not public service," Johnson said, turning to face her one last time. "That is not representation. That is exploitation." He looked her in the eye. "Shame on you, Chairwoman Waters. Shame on you." Johnson turned and walked out. The double doors swung shut behind him with a final heavy thud. Inside the room, chaos erupted. The gallery exploded into applause, not just from partisans, but from the constituents in the front row. Marcus stood up and clapped, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Keisha wiped tears from her eyes, finally feeling seen. Jamal nodded slowly, watching the man who had spoken for him. Waters sat alone at the table. Her papers were scattered. Her water glass was empty. Her career, built on the image of the fearless fighter, lay in ruins around her. She had tried to reclaim her time, but Mike Johnson had reclaimed the truth. Epilogue. The video hit the internet like a meteor. Within 2 hours, it had 10 million views. By midnight, it was at 38 million. By the next morning, 50 million people had watched the dismantling of Maxine Waters. The headline was simple and ubiquitous. Mike Johnson destroys Maxine Waters. But it was the substance that stuck. The phrase, reclaiming taxpayer money, became an instant meme, flipping her own brand against her. Young voters, who had once idolized Auntie Maxine for her sass, watched the video and saw the receipts. They saw the $750,000 to the daughter. They saw the mansion. They saw the hypocrisy. The comments section was a graveyard for her reputation. She really lives in a $6 million mansion? Her daughter got $750K? Most corrupt 4 times? How is she still there? The poverty pimp label stuck. It wasn't just a slur anymore. It was a thesis statement backed by evidence. It became the shorthand for a specific type of political corruption, profiting from the problems you are paid to solve. Waters didn't resign. She refused to step down. But the power was gone. She was stripped of her ranking member status by a vote of the full House. She faced a new ethics investigation. She became a pariah in her own party, a symbol of the corruption they claimed to oppose. She was radioactive. In District 43, the signs began to appear. Not campaign signs, protest signs. Printed on them was a simple question, overlaid on a picture of her mansion. Do you live here? She doesn't. Mike Johnson didn't gloat. He didn't go on a victory tour. He went back to work. But he had established a new blueprint for political combat. Civility. Evidence. Relentlessness. He showed that you didn't need to shout to win. You didn't need to call names. You just needed to tell the truth. He had walked into the lion's den armed only with 3 banker boxes and a polite demeanor. And he had walked out the victor. And in the end, the woman who spent a lifetime reclaiming her time found that she had run out of it. The gavel had fallen, and the verdict was in. The gentleman from Louisiana had won.